Book 4, Part 4, Chapter 5. Alyssa? I finally whispered. Please, Michael, can't you see how torn I am? Just for a minute. My feet took an involuntary step backwards. Why in the world was she here? Her father is on the council, Track hissed, and I sighed. My Uncle Brent. Actually, he was my dad's cousin, but I had always called him my uncle. Why would he bring her here? Phil sighed and I turned. Ignore her, he stated, putting his hand on my back. Then another female voice joined the first. Miss Michaels, I am sure that the orders Mr. Blvd gave her security guards were very precise. I will be happy to advise her that you are here and forward any message. I want to see my cousin, Alyssa shouted. I could just see her standing out there, fists tight and lower lip poked out. She played the game so well. My evil cousin, who seemed to thrive on making me miserable. Well, I'm afraid you can't do that right now. Alyssa was annoying Miss Mullender. Suddenly, my cousin didn't seem quite so bad. Phil moved me a bit, and I looked up at him. He shook his head. I don't like that look in your eyes. Track chuckled. Come on, can we have a little fun? No. Track and I looked at him, and he shook his head. Not that kind. Track, did Ryan actually order us not to get in trouble? I asked, looking at the door but leaning towards him a bit. My best friend tapped his chin. You know, I don't recall the alpha zap when he said it, he shrugged. So, we could get in major trouble, but... I smiled. That was good enough for me. A direct order from an alpha was something a pack wolf did not question. Phil looked at us both like we had lost our minds. Do you not see me standing right here? He asked, more bewildered than ticked. We both turned and Track shrugged. You can get in on it too, Phil. My wolf's eyes widened and I bit my lip to keep from smiling. He had never really seen this side of me and my best friend. Track and I spent many, many years getting into trouble, and we were pretty good at it. You do realize I'm also your alpha. I stepped over, lifted up, and kissed him. Okay, fine. You can go first. Track laughed and Phil blinked, still trying to figure out if we were joking or not. See? I can hear them, Alyssa yelled from the hallway. Track slapped his hand over his mouth and I sighed. She already knew we were in here. Michael and Martin wouldn't be guarding the room otherwise. He nodded and we both looked at Phil. So, you in? Track whispered and I giggled. No, Phil stated, but we saw the twinkle in his eye. That meant not our way, but he was in. Then someone knocked on the door. Wow. She has some nerve, Track whistled. How come he can go in and I can't? Alyssa raged. Phil headed towards the door and shook his head when we tried to follow. So Track and I waited, watching the door. His head disappeared outside, and I think I saw a tuft of white blonde hair bouncing in front of him. I tilted my head, and then Phil moved, just enough to let Dr. John and his bag in. I moaned and Track sighed. So much for fun. So, how's my favorite patient? The young-looking vampire doctor asked as he walked towards me. If he wasn't a torture specialist, I might actually think he was cute. His blonde hair was tossed, but not in a stylish way, more in a I have more important things to do than worry about my hair kind of way. His blue eyes were deep, and his frame was hidden under work slacks and those funky long white jackets that people in his profession seemed so fond of. He looked at me and then gestured to the bench at the end of the bed. I sat down and he smiled. "You have quite the lineup out there," he chuckled as he opened his bag. "That's my cousin Alyssa," I shrugged. "She's a bit mental." He laughed and pulled out his stethoscope. "Well, she certainly has your guards in an uproar." "She has that effect on people," Track smiled, sitting on the other side of me. "Poor Michael," I sighed, with a smile. Phil shook his head, standing over the doctor. "You two worry me sometimes." "Just sometimes?" Track grinned, and I bumped his arm with mine and giggled. After the usual inspection, Dr. John sighed. "I do have to take some blood now." "Okay," I replied, less than enthusiastic. My other doctors back at the manor prodded me and poked me every chance they got. Dr. John at least acted sorry for what he was about to do. He was quick and put the vial of my odd red liquid into a lined box and shoved it in his bag. "Well now, let's look at that arm." "Let's," I chirped, which made him smile. Phil bent over us and shook his head. "She keeps taking the splint off." "Tattletale," I huffed, but for some reason I was still smiling. Just the promise of mischief had brightened my mood. My wolf winked at me and my heart skipped a beat. He was so hot. I smiled and watched his face as the doctor felt my arm, making small sounds under his breath. Another doctor thing, I guess. "Tingling," Track whispered, and I cleared my throat and sat up. "Her arm tingles?" the doctor asked, suddenly frowning and looking at me. My best friend laughed, and I shook my head. "No, he's just been cooped up too long." Then my smile did slip, just a bit. "How are Rock and Cal doing?" The doctor looked up at me. "Well, Rock is a rock," he chuckled, as if that was a very original joke. "He will be fine in a day or two." "And Cal?" I whispered, nervous now. "He is tough too, but it will take more than a few days for him. He will recover fully, though," he added quickly when he saw the side effects his words had on me. "Can I go see them?" The doctor put the splint back on and wrapped it. "Rock is open for visitors, and I believe is coming to see you shortly." I frowned, and he shook his head. "Cal needs rest. Lots of rest right now. I keep him sedated to keep him still." He looked over at Phil. My wolf nodded. "I'll talk to Ryan, but we won't go against the doctor's orders." I nodded quickly. How bad was he? "Her arm?" Dr. John smiled at our click alpha. "I'm happy to say it's coming along nicely." He winked at me like it was some huge feat that I had anything to do with. "The splint can come off tomorrow, but she'll need to keep it wrapped a while longer and we'll need to be careful with it." He lifted his bag and nodded. "Well then, I know you don't like us whitecoats much, so I'll be off." And then he left, having to squeeze out the door with my cousin still fussing on the other side. "Raina," she yelled as it closed. "Please, I just want to see you, to know how you're doing. Please." I groaned and leaned back against the post of the bed. How long is she going to stay out there? "I bet she'll stay out there for at least another 20 minutes, Track stated, and my brows lifted. "I say only 5. I grinned at him, then shrugged. "She will storm off to try to get someone else to let her in." Track flinched. I had a good point. "I'll bet you both she leaves sooner than that." We looked over at Phil, and he nodded. "What's the bet?" Track asked slowly. "If I'm right," my wolf stated, his brown eyes twinkling, "then Raina will wear that shirt for the next 24 hours. Or another one of mine, if that one gets dirty." My nose wrinkled and Track chuckled. Then our alpha turned to him. and you will refer to me as Click Alpha Phil for the same 24 hours. Both our eyes bulged, and then Track frowned. And if you lose? Phil shrugged, and Track nodded. If you lose, you will call us Mr. Track and Miss Raina for 24 hours. Harmless enough, I thought, but still fun. Track and I had bet worse, much worse, but we weren't sure how far Phil would go. Best to start out mild with him and then test his bravery next time. Done, Phil stated, standing up. Track and I jumped up as well. My best friend pointed to the nightstand. There's the clock. Start it now. All three of us sat and watched the digital clock, listening to Alyssa whine and try to order my guards to let her in. Phil stood confidently, his arms crossed and a small smile on his face. 1 minute, Track whispered as the last digit changed. Then everything went quiet. I stiffened and looked at Track. His eyes were as wide as mine. No way, he whispered. Phil chuckled and headed towards the door. Let's have a look, shall we? No way, Track whispered again as we both followed him. When he got to the door, he gave us one last smile and then flung it open. Michael and Martin were standing now, both looking more than annoyed. I pushed past him and stepped into the hallway, looking both ways. She's gone, I gasped. Track peered down both sides, and then we both looked at Phil, who was grinning. How in the world? My best friend whispered, then shook his head. So Track, Phil grinned. How about getting us some food? I'm kinda hungry. He patted his stomach for emphasis, and Track's lip twitched. One thing about wolves, though, a bet is a bet. To go back on one was serious, and, well, it never happened. I felt sorry for him. All I had to do was wear my wolf's shirt. It was big, really big, but I liked wearing it. Sure thing, Click Alpha Phil, Track hissed, but he wasn't embarrassed. He was just ticked for losing. Track didn't like losing a bet. I bit my lip to keep from smiling and watched him turn and storm down the hallway. Phil smiled at me and glanced at my shirt. I grinned and looked at Michael. Where did she go? My bodyguard shook his head, his face still showing signs of her temper tantrum. She was going on and on about getting in that door, he stated. Then suddenly her phone went off. Seems her dad heard what she was up to and ordered her to stand down. So she left, just like that. He shook his head. She'll be back, though. Not for a while, Phil smiled, then put his arm around my waist and walked us back into the room. How did you know? He chuckled, pulling me into his arms. I just listened. When my brows crunched, he kissed me. While you two were going on about it, I tuned in. I listened. Wolf skills. He winked and I frowned, trying to process what had happened. His ears had always been good, better than good, but still. My brows lifted then, and I smiled. Impressive. Rock showed up before Track got back with the food, and the three of us were chatting away on the couch. I had told Rock about the bet, and he informed us how lame it was. You had them square, he said, looking at Phil as Track walked in with the food. And all you took was a title and a shirt? He shook his head in disappointment. I thought I'd go easy on them, our Click Alpha smiled, then winked at me. Plus, having her wear my shirt? There's nothing lame about that. I smiled at him, and Rock clucked his tongue and then nodded, taking a sandwich off the platter that Track had set on a small table he pulled over. This place is crawling with council members, he said, also grabbing a sandwich. Rock nodded. But they're not as scary as that cousin of yours. He even shivered for emphasis. Jackson showed up a few minutes later, and we all sat and talked about absolutely nothing. It was nice. A maid showed up at one point, wanting to get my dirty clothes. We all sat quietly as she went into the bathroom and then left with her booty of laundry. So now what? Track finally stated, taking the last sandwich. Everyone looked at me and I shrugged. I don't know. What's there to do around here? There is that pool, Phil smiled, and I looked at him. You swim? I winced, not meaning for it to come out that way. I swam almost daily at home, and the guys had joined me when they came to visit. Phil, however, had never participated on the few times he came to the manor. The guys chuckled, and I frowned. I didn't mean. You know, she's gonna have to swim in that shirt, Track said in a very serious tone. I looked down at myself, and Phil nodded. She'll be fine. Like I said, us wolves took our bets very seriously. That thing is so big on her, it'll drown her, Rock huffed. But Phil only smiled and stood. Guess I was gonna go swimming in his shirt. The only thing I didn't like about that was it would lose his smell. You can put on a clean one when you get out, he whispered into my ear as he took my hand and we headed towards the door. What about when she showers afterwards? Click Alpha Phil. Track tried with a triumphant nod. Guess he meant to make mine as hard as his. Yikes. I hadn't thought about that. Phil put his hands on the doorknob and looked at him. She doesn't have to wear it while she's in the shower. And you don't have to call me Click Alpha Phil when you're in the shower. How's that? Rock and I laughed, but Track only gave a low growl. Thankfully, the hallway was still empty, aside from my guards. They both stood when we filed out, and Phil explained our plans. Michael nodded, and Martin pushed the little thing that now hung off one of his own ears. Michael actually walked just in front of me, and when I looked back, I saw Martin taking the rear. As we turned the corner, I moaned. 2 more massive guards stepped up and joined us. One walked further ahead of our party, and one stayed back with Martin. 4 guards? Just to walk down a hallway? I whispered into Phil's ear. He let go of my hand and put his arm around my waist. I liked it when he did that, so I smiled and my annoyance dipped. The guard in the lead stopped and turned, giving Michael some weird hand signal. They were so Secret Service sometimes. Michael adjusted himself so he was directly in front of me and slowed, causing the rest of us to do the same. She is not to be disturbed, I heard the front man state in a low, firm voice. Please return to your area and stay there. Wow, that was rude. I couldn't see anyone, partly because of Michael's size and partly because the first guard had stopped the person just off to the side. Michael started to walk again, and Phil kissed my cheek. He was amazingly understanding to put up with all of this. There were 2 more encounters on the trip to the pool. One was a female who was brushed off as quickly as the first. The last was a man. He wasn't as compliant and demanded to be allowed to say hello to me. He argued with the first guard, and Michael was talking into his earpiece. 2 more guards showed up, and I had to stand behind the living pillar and wait, still not able to say anything. Why do they want to see me so badly? I asked when we finally stepped into the pool room. No one answered me, and I quickly forgot my question. The place was mesmerizing. The air was warm, and I think there was even a breeze somehow. It really felt like we were outside. The changing rooms are over there, the first guard stated, pointing to a line of small doors made out of chunky wood. When we got to them, I looked at Phil. Can I put a suit on underneath at least? Michael's brows went up, but Phil only nodded, smiling. We did notice male-female signs engraved on each door. I picked a female one and stepped in. There were 2 full-length mirrors in one corner, a slated bench, a bamboo rack to put your clothes on, and a whole rod of suits in every shape, style, and color possible. Wow. Our pool had extras for guests, but this was like being at a mall. There were even little clips on top of the hangers that labeled what size they were, and they were organized accordingly. I pushed the others away and started to browse through mine. It didn't really matter what it looked like, since I would be wearing Phil's big blue t-shirt over it. That made me a little braver, and I plucked a pink bikini off the rack. Serves him right, I thought, smiling. I would never wear something like this normally, and I fully planned on telling him what he was missing by the cover-up. Feeling very proud of myself, I slipped the t-shirt back over my head, sat the rest of my things on one of the shelves, and stepped out. Phil was the only one waiting for me, but I couldn't care less. He was standing there, bare-chested, with a pair of deep green swimming trunks on. At least I think they were green. I was too busy staring at his upper body. He was strong, and his muscles were well-defined without being so bulky they looked freaky. Without thinking, I reached up and put my hand on his chest. He stepped closer, and I smiled. I ran my hand slowly across his hard chest, every line becoming engraved into my memory. My breath quivered a little, and he reached up and put his hand over mine. I blinked slowly and then lifted my eyes to his. Those brown eyes smiled at me and pulled me into them, and I went willingly. When his lips touched mine, I heard a soft moan, and I couldn't tell if it was from me or from both of us. With our hands still between us, he wrapped the other around me and held me tightly. My head began to spin a little, and I leaned into the kiss. It was as if we were one body instead of two. "Come on, you two," Rock snapped. I went to pull back, but Phil held me, shifting his weight a little and keeping me against him. "Tingle overload, guys." That made me giggle, and Phil pulled back just enough to smile at me. "I keep forgetting about that," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I don't," Phil whispered back, his voice low and deep, sending a wave of emotions through me. "I just don't care," he chuckled then, still watching me. His eyes were soft, yet showed so much strength at the same time. He loved me completely, and I loved him. "Seriously?" Track yelled, and I grinned. "We should," I stuttered, but couldn't finish the statement. No matter what it was doing to the others, I wanted to be right here forever. "I'm so glad you decided to enjoy the pool," came a chipper voice that ran like a nail through my mind. My eyes tightened, and I growled as the rush ebbed a bit. Phil chuckled, but kept me in his arms as we both turned our heads. Miss Mullender maneuvered through the sand as if she wore flip-flops and not 4-inch heels. She was in a cream skirt now, with a white blouse that was both sophisticated and yet high fashion. I really didn't like her. I looked around, seeing Martin and one of the guards at the door. Where was Michaud? "Oh," she gasped, seeing us in each other's arms. I lifted my chin a bit, and Phil chuckled. "Do we not have any suits that you like?" My stance faltered a bit. I thought she was put off by us nearly making out poolside, but all she cared about was what I was wearing. "This is what I'm going to be swimming in," I almost spat. Hackles were up, and I felt Phil gently rub my back to calm me. She looked completely baffled by the comment then, in her animated way, tried to recover. "Absolutely." She really needed a new word. "Well then, I will have some refreshments sent down immediately." She looked at Phil when she made the comment. He didn't explain that they had just eaten. A wolf rarely ever turned down food. There are pool chairs and accessory in the trunk near the water, she stated, turning and pointing to a large box made of the same chunky wood as the rooms. I saw someone move and turned, seeing Michaud standing a yard away. I gave him a "how did she get in here" look, and he shrugged. Great. Seems my dad's hands-off Raina policy didn't apply to little Miss Assistant here. Seems I need to have a talk with him about that. She annoyed me. Phil finally took a step back and pulled our hands down, but held mine. Ready? I nodded, and he thanked her, although I'm not sure for what, and we turned and walked down the man-made path. When we reached the edge, I had pushed her out of my mind and was glad she hadn't followed us. Track and Rock were already in the water, and Jackson was bent over the chest, pulling things out. By the way, I whispered, leaning up into Phil's ear, under this shirt is one very little, very pink bikini. When his eyes widened, I gave a triumphant nod and then ran into the water. That would show him. I dove under and came up quickly, pushing the hair back from my face and smiling. I jumped a bit when Phil was directly in front of me. I'm changing the bet, he said with a hunger in his eyes that made me backpedal a bit. You can't change a bet, Jackson announced, and I turned, seeing him laying on a lounge chair and smiling at me. I let my breath out. That's right, I confirmed, nodding. I was on my tiptoes and moved up a bit so that my feet were firmly on the sandy bottom. Phil turned to me. I can, and I do. He grinned, his eyes watching me hard. I flinched, and he winked. It's not really changing it. He shot Jackson a hard look. It's just clarifying it. Rock and Track swam over, and Jackson gave them a quick rundown of what they had missed. You can't change a bet. Click Alpha Phil, Track huffed, and I nodded quickly. Again, I'm not changing, just clarifying, Phil stated, the hunger fading and an impish grin taking its place. He kept his eyes on me as he spoke. I said she didn't have to wear the shirt in the shower, but what I meant is she didn't have to wear it in the water. Shower, bath, pool. My eyes popped, and I quickly brought my arms up in front of me, remembering what was underneath this shirt. I had purposely picked a very skimpy bikini, knowing I could taunt him without having to expose it. That's changing it, Rock stated, and I nodded again, my eyes still wide. Phil shook his head. It's clarifying, like I said. I wouldn't expect her to wear it in the tub. The three guys started to argue the point. Jackson was actually siding with Phil now, but Track and Rock were dead set against it, stating it broke the rules. Finally, Phil turned and looked at them all. Am I the click alpha or not? They all stopped and gave him an odd look. Course you are, Rock chuckled, but bets are bets. We have rules, Phil. I lifted my chin and smiled, but Phil's chuckle worried me. So, if I told you that she has a very little pink bikini under that shirt, I gasped and their eyes widened. Rock's grin made me groan, and he looked down at my shirt. Seriously? He couldn't really mean to do this to me, could he? I bit my lower lip, and panic crept through me as I hugged myself tighter. Track huffed. Figures. Then he looked at the others. I'm not buying it. Even if she does, he wouldn't want us around to find out. My head tilted and Jackson nodded. Right. He gets us to agree to change, and then he kicks us all out, he chuckled. Smooth, but nope. What was happening? Phil was our click alpha. He could order them to accept the change, I think. I suddenly felt every inch of that little bathing suit clinging to me, And there really was only inches. Phil turned to me and sighed, pretending to look sad. They're right. I would have kicked him out. He moved closer to me. If I had gotten the change, there was no way I would have let them see. I huffed hard and turned, then dove under the water. Some nerve. Within minutes, my panic and anger were forgotten. I loved to swim, and this pool was amazing. The water was warm and didn't smell of chemicals, even to our sensitive noses. Rock opted to lounge on one of the floating chairs, and Jackson set up a water basketball hoop. Track turned on the waterfall, and we all took our turns standing under it to enjoy the sensation. At one point, Ryan showed up. We all moved inland a bit, but he put his hand up and said he had just stopped by to say hello. After he left, we returned to our games. Rock joined a few times, but he would crawl back up on the chair when he got too tired. We did slow down to watch a few maids come in, with Miss Mullender standing over them. They laid out a few large blankets and then laid platters of food on that. "Food!" Rock cried out, hopped off his chair, and waded into shore. A maid quickly handed him a large towel. I turned and saw Jackson stepping out of the water, too. "Sorry, guys, need to refuel," Track announced as he swam past us. Phil and I were standing on a small ledge, holding on to the side of the pool. We were in the deep end, but the ledge allowed you to stand and relax. He smiled at me. "So I have to ask, why did you put that suit on?" "Because I knew I would be safe with your shirt over it," I smiled. He chuckled. "That is cruel, you know." "Yeah, I know." I grinned, then leaned over and kissed him. Chapter 6. We finally joined the guys on the blankets and laughed and talked while they consumed all the food. It almost felt like being home. Well, like when I would go and visit at Polson. We relaxed and were enjoying ourselves, and that felt good. Wolves did know how to have fun. They did rib me about the swimsuit, just to the edge of annoying, but I got even. When we came out of the changing rooms, I handed it to Phil, and the look on his face was priceless. He had brought me a dry shirt of his. This one was a darker gray. I stood there in my jeans and his shirt and smiled as I plopped the nearly non-existent, still slightly damp, bikini into his hand. The other three guys were just as stunned, and Rock tried to reach for it. Phil growled and balled it up into his fist, the whole thing disappearing. This was real fun. I smiled and winked as I bounced towards the doors. "I can't believe you put that thing on," Track chuckled as they caught up with me. I shrugged. I only did because I knew I had to wear the shirt over it. Yeah, there was no way I would have ever worn that otherwise. I was much more a one-piece kind of girl. The guys had left their swim trunks in the changing room hampers. My little pink strips of cloth went back to the room with us, tightly clutched in Phil's hand. For some reason, I liked that he took it. It was sort of like him refusing to let anyone else see what I had worn. As bizarre as it sounds, it made him incredibly sexy to me, and I snuggled up in his arms when we all sat on the rug in front of the fire. I was in a fresh, dry splint now, and I'm not exactly sure where he put that bikini. The amusement of hearing Track call him Click Alpha Phil had quickly worn off, though. Track used it as a tactic that worked. He overused the title until Phil moaned instead of snickered when he said it. I had to give it to him, though. It was a good strategy. Phil growled at him a few times when it went too far over the top, but my best friend just shrugged and proclaimed that wolves didn't back out on bets. It seemed this one might backfire on my wolf a little. Rock finally admitted he was tired. I hugged him before he left and watched him go. He wasn't limping too much now, and the swim seemed to have done him some good. It reminded me of when Paige, my physical therapist, had told me how good water workouts were for healing. I felt a stab of sadness ripple through me at the thought of her. My dad had fired her for helping me back in the city. She and Michael had just started to open up with each other, and I had ruined that. I sighed and looked towards the door, wondering if the two of them really were seeing each other like Aunt Mary had told me. I hoped so. A knock on the door drew our attention, and I smiled and stood up when my dad walked in. He walked over and I frowned, seeing how tired he looked. Not like he needed sleep, but he looked mentally tired. He smiled at me, though, and gave me a hug. I heard you finally went for a swim. It was great. That pool is amazing. He chuckled and kissed the top of my head. There was a softer knock, and I looked around him as Miss Mullender walked in. Was she my dad's shadow or mine? I couldn't quite tell. She smiled at us in that, "Aw, isn't that cute father and daughter together" sort of way. I rolled my eyes and then straightened my shirt when she looked at it too long. I liked wearing Phil's shirts. True, they were big and baggy, but they were his. Your father thought you might enjoy seeing the theater, she stated, and I looked up at him. I'm going out? No, he chuckled. Oliver has a small movie theater here, in his home. Wow, that was impressive. Phil, Track, and Jackson were standing now, too. I was wondering what movies you would like me to have set up, she chirped, holding up that flat little computer and standing ready. Her eyes twinkled as if she completely enjoyed her duties. I think there was more to it than that. When I took too long to recover, the guys stepped in, quickly naming off titles. She laughed her little bird laugh and tapped on her screen, nodding as she did. Finally, she glanced up at me. Now, what about you? When I didn't respond right away, she chuckled. I can get anything, even newly released films, and I'm sure that you have some other movies you'd like to see. I shook my head to show I didn't understand. Track smiled. She thinks Ray might want to watch some sappy chick flick. All the guys laughed then, including my dad. Once again, Miss Mullender looked a bit miffed. I guess she didn't like not knowing everything first. Interesting. Jeeps doesn't watch those kind of movies, Jackson explained, grinning. She likes the bloody horror or action movies, like us. Jeeps? I moaned, and my dad looked down at me. Jackson shrugged. Just an inner-pack joke, he stated, and I gave him a quick smile of thanks for saving me that humiliation. Being called Glass Princess by him was funny, and it had a caring edge to the poke, but having her know that about me turned my stomach. Oh, she whispered, looking down at her screen as if she didn't know how to respond or what file to put that in. Great. Now I was back to being a non-girly girl. I couldn't help it if I liked action movies. They were a rush. My fascination with horror movies was usually limited to vampire and werewolf flicks. I loved sitting there watching what the human world thought of us. It was entertaining, so sue me. I like other movies too, I grumbled. Well, all of you decide, and then go watch a few, my dad smiled, giving me another hug. With that, he left, and the guys crowded around her and her flat computer, going over the list and narrowing it down. Ignoring them, I walked into the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. Longish, straight, black hair, no makeup, jeans and a massive t-shirt. I sighed. Allison was a textbook girly girl, with her fancy hair, fuzzy cashmere, and even her laugh screamed female. I missed her. She was my closest female friend, even if we hadn't known each other that long. Complete opposites, but she never put me down or looked at me with a hidden grin. She was genuine and sincere. I didn't have to pretend around her. My throat tightened a bit. When I was with the pack, I felt relaxed, and like I was good enough just being me. But here with the vampires, I felt like I was constantly being judged and measured. My dad was the rare exception there. Even my cousin commented on my lack of feminine appeal and only tried to get close to me when there was something in it for her. That something was sometimes the simple enjoyment of seeing me get into trouble. Michael never judged me either. He, Allison, and my dad were, and Jonathan. I winced at the name. Vampires were so complicated. Playing all their little games, smiling in your face while whispering behind your back. How did they do it? It was exhausting just thinking about it. With wolves, you knew where you stood. Their hackles stood, their scent changed, body language, eyes, they all let you know what was going on. Like Teresa, I didn't have to ever wonder if she liked me. I knew she didn't. There was an odd comfort in that. Tay? I turned as Phil walked in, concerned taking his smile away. I gave him a small smile and turned from the mirror, waiting. What's wrong? Then he chuckled. I mean, what brought you in here? I glanced at the mirror again and went to respond when he sighed. Don't let her get to you. I shrugged, and he put his arms around my waist a bit, looking down at me. You should never compare yourself to what others try to make you see when someone looks down their nose at you. My brows wrinkled as I tried to process that, and he chuckled. They do try to intimidate you. They try to intimidate you because you are a threat. A threat? I gasped, looking up at him. He nodded, keeping his voice down. Think about it in wolf terms. If you pass by a scared little rabbit, one quick growl and off they run. Yeah, so? So let's say you come across another wolf, or better yet, a bear. You try to get downwind so you can sneak up on them. And if it's too late, what if you turn a corner and there's the bear? I crunched my brows in thought. Hackles up, puff up so you look bigger, front legs wide, head down a bit, and eyes up. Pull back to show all your teeth and... My eyes widened. Vampires do the same thing? He laughed quietly and hugged me closer. If you strip it down to the basics, yes, it's all a game. Miss Mullender, Alyssa, they're used to getting their way. Your dad's assistant is used to running things and has authority over a lot of people. You, my dear, are untouchable. I'm what? You are the only thing that could knock her completely off the tower she has fought and clawed her way up. You are the boss's daughter. The big, end of the line, boss's daughter. I huffed, but only because it made sense. So, she's used to knowing everyone's business, Phil whispered, kissing my temple. She has access to their entire lives and uses that, pretending to be offering them what they want before they even know what they want. She is also sublimely telling them, look how much I know about you. There's a lot of power in that. My brows lifted. You could tell all of that? He nodded. I watch with my wolf eyes, ears, and mind. When I do, it's very obvious. Wow, I whispered, looking around his shoulder to the half-open door. Then I smiled up at him. You're amazing. Phil chuckled and kissed me. I still don't like her, I said quietly. And you shouldn't. She's power-hungry and will use whatever and whoever she has to. She has worked very hard to get where she is. An assistant to the highest-ranking vampire? He whistled quietly. No easy task, and that has to carry a lot of weight. Except when it comes to me, I replied softly, thinking and still amazed by it all. Exactly. Her only hope is to win you over. She's not used to having to try so hard or to walk on eggshells, and she certainly isn't used to having to cater so intensely to a female pack wolf. He laughed again and I bit my lip, but then giggled too. That is what I am, I smiled, liking how it sounded. He nodded. Yes, you are. And actually, he shrugged, technically, you're a Click Alpha's mate. My eyes widened. Wait, you mean I finally outranked Track? He smiled and gave me a soft squeeze. Technically, yes, but I think we have enough issues going on right now. For what? He shrugged. Being an alpha carries a lot of responsibility. Being an alpha's mate sometimes carries as much, if not more. I hadn't thought about that. Hey, can you back off the tingly thing? Jackson stated as he pushed the door open. Almost had me ordering a mushy film before I even realized it. He looked utterly disgusted, and I put one hand over my mouth and laughed. Sorry. So, can you bottle it for a bit? When my head bobbed, he smiled, winked, and went back into the room. All better now? Phil asked. Am I a tomboy? His brows lifted, and I took a small step back and watched his face closely. I was grateful for the amazing insight into Dad's assistant, but that left the other question. Tay, there's nothing boy about you, anywhere, he smiled. Then he let his eyes slowly move down me until I thought I couldn't breathe. What the heck was that? Just by looking at me, I felt as if my skin was alive and moving. Every part of me felt wired. I shivered a bit and he chuckled, reached out and took my hand. You are Raina. I love her and I love her just the way she is. So, you don't secretly wish that I wore makeup and tighter jeans and low-cut shirts and hot pink bikinis? His face seemed to darken a bit, but he smiled. You are beautiful without makeup. Tight jeans and low-cut shirts would just have me have to fight the guys off. And, as for that bikini, he leaned into my ear, I would have to kill any male that laid eyes on you in that. He kissed my cheek. So you're doing me a favor there. I smacked his chest playfully, but was smiling. I liked that jealous streak in him. He wasn't freaky jealous like some of the males I saw in the movies, but it was just enough to make my heart beat faster and made me glad he picked me. Where is that bikini anyway? I smiled coyly. He lifted a brow. Why? Well, if it would cause such a death toll, we should probably destroy it, I teased, walking slowly past him and letting my shoulder barely brush his. For wolves, that was flirting. I heard him give a low moan, followed by a deep growl, and both made me smile. Just as I stepped out of the door, he leaned into my ear. Just knowing you had it on under my shirt drives me insane. There was a deep sound in his throat as he whispered that made me instantly close my eyes and tip my head up slightly to one side, exposing my neck. Another wolf thing. His hand came around my stomach and my breath caught. Phil's voice was so low and deep that it rumbled through me as he whispered, I'm keeping it as a reminder and have it tucked away for safekeeping. Then Track cleared his throat, loudly. I blinked and turned, seeing the guys standing there with red faces, and Miss Mullender standing there with, well, vampires couldn't blush, but the look on her face was a mix of horror and jealousy. Wow, maybe Phil was onto something after all. I looked at her and this time sized her up, with my wolf eyes. Her beauty seemed to be more like a suit of armor, something she used in her battles. Her sparkling blue eyes were cunning and watched everything, ready to change angles, size, and emotions, depending on the situation. Oh, she was good. "Where's Jay?" Phil asked, and I turned from my visual inspection. My wolf gave me an ease-up look, and I realized how hard I had been looking at her. Oops. "He went to get Rock and order snacks," Track stated, still standing near Miss Mullender. "You just ate," I chuckled, knowing it didn't matter. "So?" "Well, I will have everything set up and ready to go in about 20 minutes, she replied, looking up from her computer book thing. Her eyes moved to me, but she seemed uneasy. Suddenly, I wondered if she noticed how hard I had been watching her. I hadn't done it to put her off guard, but that was an okay perk. "Would you like to see what they've chosen to watch?" Translation, you might want to come check out this list, it's awful. I smiled and shrugged. No, I trust him. Track chuckled and I gave him a hard look. He shrugged back. Hey, you can't whine about it then. Suddenly, I wondered just what we were about to see. We decided to follow her out and hang out in the theater while she got things ready, just for something different to do. I was antsy, and even though I loved the swim, I needed to find something to occupy my mind. Michael, Martin, and the two new guards surrounded us as we walked. Miss Mullender led the way, calling out to the house help as we went, strutting and trying to claim her authority. I smiled, though, no longer as put off as I was. Phil squeezed my hand and I smiled at him. He was perfect. Partway down another hall, the wall of Michael and Martin closed in front of me. I frowned until a voice rang out. Raina! Ugh, Alyssa. I heard her run towards us, and one of the guards in back stepped up. Now there were 3 massive guards blocking her way. Oh, this is absolutely ridiculous, she screeched as the 3 of them stepped up to keep her at bay. Raina, dear, really? You and I knew they would eventually find out, she huffed loudly. I tried to keep them as busy as long as I could. You have to believe me. My head tilted, and then I realized she thought I was mad at her about the night I snuck out of the manor and went to Polson. The memory of that night oozed in my mind, and I put a hand on my stomach. That's the night the feud between my 2 worlds started, and I started it. Unintentionally, but completely. She had helped me sneak out. I actually went to her and begged her to help me. Hey, when you need something done, you go to an expert, right? She helped me. I knew she had her own selfish reasons, but part of me wanted to believe that she really did want to help. I sighed. It was hard listening to her apologize and try to defend herself. I wasn't mad at her. I actually felt bad for pulling her into it. Plus, she was family. Annoying, conniving, and vicious, but family. I'm not mad at you, Alyssa, I stated, and she went silent. I tried to lean over and look around Martin, but he shifted position. I growled and stepped up, lifting my head to talk over him. I've never been mad at you about that night. Had to keep it honest. I had other things I was still ticked at her about. I shivered, thinking about running around the manor with those ridiculous pink-frilled bags on that hideous treasure hunt. Then why, her voice shook just a bit, why don't you want to see me? Yikes. Guilt was getting good at the sucker punches. I tried to push Martin out of the way and huffed. I might as well try to move a mountain. I turned and looked at the form next to him. Michael shifted his head just a little. When I nodded, he moved, slightly, letting me step up between them. I still couldn't walk right through, and I growled. Then I looked at her. Miss Mullender had her phone to her ear and was whispering into it. Alyssa, I'm not mad at you. There's just a lot going on right now. That was definitely true. She bit her lower lip and took a step closer. Michael shook his head and she pursed her lips. Why won't they let me closer? I just want to give you a hug. I've been so worried, Raina. Worried, completely sick about you. I sighed and Michael finally relented and moved just a bit more. That's all she needed. She nearly lunged at me and wrapped her arms around my neck. I gasped and had to stop myself from body slamming her out of sheer instinct. Oh, Raina, my poor dear, it must have been so awful. I wonder how she was able to show so much emotion and not have the ability to cry. When she took a step back, she grabbed both of my hands and then gasped, looking down at the splint. You've been hurt. I guess she hadn't heard everything. Michael was talking in his earpiece thing now, too, but I tried not to listen. It's okay. Just a little accident, 100% my own fault. Not even, she threw out, her pain turning to anger in a blink. You have been pulled, shoved, drug everywhere and anywhere. Wow, she actually looked mad. She was good. I am even highly ticked at Uncle Thomas and Jonathan, she shook her head hard. What in the world were they all thinking? She stroked the side of my hair and my hackles went up. I knew she really didn't care what happened to me, but I was not a touchy-feely person outside of my pack. Her eyes scanned mine, and then she smiled. Well, I'm here now. I'm going to make certain that you aren't drug off to some... Her nose wrinkled like she smelled something foul. Then Trax stepped up and crossed his arms over his chest. She looked at him and lifted her chin. I'm not just talking about what you all did to my poor cousin. My uncle and her betrothed are just as much to blame. I moved as Phil moved next to me. I guess she was more in the dark than she knew. This was suddenly getting more complicated and more uncomfortable. Now, she said, giving a small shiver and turning her smile back to me, where are we off to? Yep, she flipped between emotions like track with a remote. It kind of made you dizzy. I started... Crap, did this part ever get easier? Alyssa? I knew if I didn't set one thing straight, it would hurt Phil. Yes, dear? She blinked her blue eyes at me, keeping them wide. I'm not... Man, did it really just get really warm in this hallway? I'm not with Jonathan anymore. I ended the sentence in almost a whisper, and my eyes dropped a bit. You're not? She gasped, lowering her voice as well. I drew in a deep breath and looked up. No, I'm in love with Phil. We're together. I grabbed at the more generic term, since the word mated just got a bad reaction if the listener wasn't a wolf. Oh. When I nodded, she turned and looked at Phil, who was now standing just behind my shoulder. She stared at him for almost too long. Normally, that would have my own hackles up, but she wasn't drinking him in or flirting like she usually did. She was processing the information, and that I understood. Well then, she said, giving a small nod and letting the smile return to her face. She was still looking at him when the smile expanded. I guess this makes us family. My eyes popped, and then she shocked us both by stepping up and hugging him. His eyes were as wide as my own, and he looked at me. I shrugged, and he tapped her back in a return gesture, and then let out his breath when she let go. She shook her head and looked at me. Well, well, seems things have taken a change all right. Then my bizarre cousin bounced on her toes. So, this is different. In a good way, she giggled. And shot a quick smile at Phil. Sorry, I thought you would have heard, I grinned nervously. Her smile dipped. No, they kept a lot of it from me. I had to pry and wiggle tiny little pieces out of people. Even the help kept their lips sealed tight. That seemed to tick her off, and she shuddered. She was used to getting what she wanted, even if it was just information. The hallway went very quiet then, and I shifted uneasily on my feet. Well now, Miss Michaels, Raina has a busy schedule, Miss Mullender stated, stepping up. Alyssa went to argue when I looked past her, and she turned and glanced over her shoulder. Jonathan walked up, flanked by 2 large guards. I had never seen him with bodyguards, unless they were with me. It was odd, but an impressive look. His face was tight, and his eyes only softened when he looked at me. I quickly looked at her. Alyssa, your father would like to speak to you, Jonathan stated, coming to a stop just behind her. She huffed. Well, tell him I'll be there in a bit. I'm visiting with Raina, she smiled, and winked at me then. I will do no such thing, he replied in a low, controlled voice. Wow, her eyes widened and she turned. I think she would have shot back a sarcastic remark, but his eyes locked onto hers with a coldness that made me gasp. Then he looked up at me again, those beautiful gray eyes softening. Well then, she sighed, turning back to me and giving me a sad smile. I guess I better go see what's so urgent that he sent him to fetch me. She giggled at the end, and I winced. I was not sent to fetch anyone, Jonathan replied, keeping his eyes on me. I was on my way here for other reasons, and he asked that I pass along his request. I couldn't look away. I had never seen Jonathan act this way. He was usually so charming, even when we were confronted with people we didn't like. He kept his cool and his smile. Like my dad, his position forced him to be cordial in nearly all cases. Rumors spread through the vampire world like colds in a common room of humans, and could be just as debilitating. Alyssa huffed and hugged me again. Don't worry. As soon as I see what my dad wants, I'll come and find you. And then we'll have some catch-up time. She looked at Phil and smiled, then winked at me. And it seems we have a lot of it to do. Then she stepped over and hugged Phil again. This time, I was sure it was to get back at Jonathan, and the twitch in his lip showed it worked. She lifted her chin as she turned and then bounced down the hallway, stopping once to turn and wave to me. I lifted my hand in response, still too stunned to do anything more. And that's where I'm going to stop.